Hello, everyone. Welcome to this special webinar from OpenLMS about creating safe spaces for AI in education. Right now, you can hear my voice, but obviously you can't see me or our panelists right now. But I just wanted to, you can see them here on the screen, right? Peter Kilcoyne, Solange Lalonde, John Fila, and myself. My name is Laddick, and we are all excited to have you here. We're going to just give a few seconds, maybe a few minutes, really, to have people come into the room, come into the stage. We're doing this at 11 a.m. Eastern in New York time here in the United States. So that means that there's people from all over the world. We know we have a global audience. And so here's the thing. If you are listening to us on LinkedIn, if you're listening to us on YouTube, and I believe as well, we're broadcasting on X right now, I'd love for you to tell us where you're from. Michael Osborne, thank you so much. I already see you. The first comment, maybe I wish we had a prize for the first comment, but we don't. But I'm coming from you, or I'm broadcasting from Mexico City, Mexico. That's where. So look at that. It's 4 p.m. in the West Mids, UK. I'm assuming that everybody knows what West Mids means. That's fantastic. But usually, I can see, we can see that there's people coming into the room here, and I'd love to know where you're from. Usually, we have an audience that's coming from North America. You see Joe Tebow there, a good friend of OpenLMS and everyone else from Baltimore, Maryland. We've got Fairfield, Iowa. Thank you for being more specific, Michael, about Rugby, Warwickshire. Nice, excellent. Amy from New York, excellent. Thanks so much. We got Cincinnati, Ohio. Truth or Consequence, New Mexico. So it's a small fact that no one knows about me, but I was born in Albuquerque, so I love it. Anytime I see New Mexico, there's something about it. Chester, UK, Boston, that's fantastic. As people are coming in the room again, today we're going to be talking about what I consider, one of the most important conversations around artificial intelligence and how it plays out in the education space, right? It's really, really easy to be excited about the things that AI can do. We've all seen it with, ChatGPT. We've seen it with Midjourney. We've seen it with, so many products and services that are out there right now about, my Lord, you can create a book in 5 seconds. You can create images, in just a matter of minutes. I've had all kinds of, oh my gosh, jaw-dropping moments with my family, with my children, with other colleagues as well about, I had no idea AI could do that. But what we also know when we were in the AI and Learning Summit last year, we also know that there are a lot of interesting considerations that we need to be talking about around equity, around ethics, around privacy, around evening the playing field for people who don't have access to certain technologies and those kinds of things. And so that's what we're here to talk about today. I love this. I'm just going to give a shout out again. We got Cincinnati, Ohio. We've got Andrew again in Chester. We've got Lucas in Boston, Eduardo in Brazil. Thank you very much. Jasmine in Cincinnati, Rebecca in Johnston. Maybe it's Johnstown, Pennsylvania. And Dr. Sarita in Surrey. Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. I think we're here. I think it's time to kick us off. And so what I want to do is I want to introduce you to our panelists today. Peter, Solange, and John, but I'm going to have Solange. I'm going to have you go first. And why don't you just tell us a little about yourself and, where you're coming from and the organization you work with, et cetera.
Excellent. Hello, everyone. It's great to see some familiar faces throughout the comments. My name is Solange Lalonde. I'm joining from Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and I'm a researcher in areas dealing with curriculum and learning, transnational curriculum, and also starting to think a lot about, artificial intelligence, as well as ways that we can really create those ethical safe spaces and relational spaces for education. My company is RMTL Consulting, Inc., and that's for the relational model for teaching and learning that I developed in my graduate work. So I use that for consulting services and licensed products that are all related to relational by design.
And yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. And we will be sharing links to your resources, your site, as well as for Peter and John as well at the end of this webinar. So thanks so much for sharing. Peter, let me give you the stage as well. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Well, good afternoon, everybody, in terms of where I'm coming from. I'm not a million miles from the chap in Rugby in Warwickshire. I'm based in Bromyard in Herefordshire in England. My name's Peter Kilcoyne. I'm the Managing Director of Teachermatic, which is a platform designed to make using generative AI very easy for teaching staff. I've worked in education since 1986, for 15 years as a psychology lecturer. I've been a senior leader responsible for educational technology. I actually retired 4 years ago in a very unsuccessful retirement, and for the last few years I've been working as a consultant. Last year, done a year in Jordan, developing a blended learning strategy for the Ministry of Education in Jordan, while developing this AI platform, Teachermatic.
Well, that's fantastic. Sabah al-khair. So it's very nice to see you. Thanks for coming. John, I give you the stage to introduce yourself as well.
Hi, I'm John Fila. I spend most of my time teaching English for an online asynchronous program throughout the state of Minnesota in the US. And through that role, I've done a lot of work with instructional design, large scale OER initiatives, accessibility initiatives, and just because out of necessity of seeing these really strange student submissions just over, about a year and a half ago, I started getting into the AI space. So I've written a few books on the topic. I do a lot of professional development and speaking related specifically to AI and equity issues.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. I'm psyched. We have three great minds here, and we're going to talk about a topic that I think is extremely important. Everybody who's, for everyone who's joined us, who's listening right now, you do have the opportunity to join us. This is an interactive opportunity. If you're on YouTube or LinkedIn, you can put a comment in just under the video or just to the right of the video, and we do see it. And so throughout the hour here, we are going to be taking those questions and I'll feed them out to the panel and we'll work with them all, we'll workshop them together with you. I want to start with Peter to kick off our, to sort of kick off the session here. As I said in the beginning, it's easy to talk about the positives and whatnot, but I do want to put that, on the table. And this is something that Teachermatic specializes in. It's like, what are the most significant ways that AI is being integrated into education settings? Like, this is something that Teachermatic does. And, you've got a whole suite of tools out there. Give us, what are the benefits that you've seen? What's the feedback that you get from your user base, and maybe some of the challenges that they have? Okay,
so Teachermatic, and I will share a link and a log on to Teachermatic later today, so you can all have a go with it. It's an AI platform that's designed to make using large language models easy for teachers. When I first saw ChatGPT, well over a year ago now, a couple of years ago in its early models, it was like I couldn't believe what I was seeing, and I couldn't believe what this technology could do. To me, it was like something had dropped out of the next century into our laps, and this ability to write stuff, just giving it some prompts and it will write lesson plans, schemes of work, assessment material, all sorts of different things. And I could see that this was an incredibly powerful technology for teachers. But having worked with teachers for many years in engaging them in using educational technology, I knew that most teachers would probably struggle to make the most out of it. That to use ChatGPT and similar tools, Copilot, Bing, etc., well, you've got to be very good at this thing called prompt engineering. And that's not an easy skill, particularly for those of us who are over a certain age to learn that skill. So we developed Teachermatic as a platform which would easily enable teachers to just click on what we call generators. We've got over 70 generators now, things like scheme of work, lesson plan, multiple choice questions, email writer, learning activities, over 70 of them. Teacher just clicks on them, puts in a few keywords, and it does it for them. It'll generate sets of multiple choice questions, for example, and then allow you to export them into different learning management systems, into tools like Kahoot, quizzes, etc. So we built a lot of integration just to make it very easy for teachers to engage and use it. We launched Teachermatic just over a year ago. It's mainly being used in the UK at the moment, but we're starting to go international. It's being used by well over half of all the further education colleges in the country, plus a number of universities and schools. And one of the findings that we're most proud of is that we did a survey recently with our user base and found that the average time saving is 3.8 hours a week. So teachers are massively overloaded. I come from a teaching family. My mother was a teacher. I have two daughters who are teachers. I've been a teacher all my life. I know exactly how busy teachers are, and that's only increasing. And so this AI is proving a real time saver for teachers. So I think that's where I'd like to kick it off in terms of some of the positives.
Fantastic. John, as someone who's teaching right now as well, you're in an asynchronous class, you're teaching English out there. Take us down the, sort of a little bit of a pivot to like, what kind of inclusive environments are you seeing? How is AI opening doors for people before we maybe go into some of the challenges that you're seeing?
Yeah, so I would just maybe start with, it doesn't open doors by default. I don't think we've ever had a new technology that by default helps support marginalized populations. So I think we really have to acknowledge that going into this space, that it is presenting further inequities just through its very existence. And as people start to use it, we may be kind of deepening those. In terms of how we might think about using it to create a more inclusive space, I think that at the start, when I was working with developing new curriculum that we were looking to offer for next school year, I started prompting it to consider how we might make better lessons for students who struggle with anxiety, for students who struggle with ADHD. I can add lots of characteristics for students who are neurodiverse. I can incorporate universal design for learning components. I can put in, for instance, say I have a student who is blind, or I have a student who's vision impaired, deaf, hard of hearing. I can start to enter in characteristics of learning populations who've traditionally struggled and been underserved by traditional vendor curriculum. And I can get suggestions during the creation of those lessons that help support students across these learning populations. And then, as we go on today, I'll keep talking about how we further support other groups and categories through our prompts, but I think that's a good place to start.
Fantastic. Solange, I want to give you the opportunity as someone who's built curriculum, who's consulting with organizations, schools, corporate, etc. Why don't you take this before we move into the ethical piece as well? Like, what have you seen that you're like, wow, this is great, or wow, we can do some new stuff here?
Thank you. One of the things that I think a lot about are, when we think about education materials, whose voice is it? Whose voice is missing? And, when we think about what AI has done and how the models are trained from that global north perspective, and, in a UN report, it talks specifically about how those values are reflected in what's coming out into the curriculum. And so how do we protect, how do we create those spaces? And so I think a lot about, being able to have this as an opportunity to have a critical look as to what are we using in our classrooms and in our teaching and learning practice. And also for students, to kind of go through those critical questions that we need to look at when we think about the materials that we're using, whose perspective it is, and how do we not only, create those safe spaces, but also really prioritize and highlight and look at marginalized voices that have been excluded in that kind of striving for equity, equality.
Well, and that's then in that vein, on that, what might a safe space mean in the learning context? Like, how can we work towards ensuring that as you were just saying, like AI has been traditionally trained from that northern global north perspective. Some of the ethics around how they've been trained is a big piece of the big topic of conversation, etc. So how do we start moving in this direction, and how do we consider it, and what should I be thinking of as an educator, as someone maybe who's building curriculum, has a learning space, those kinds of things?
Yeah, there's a researcher, Dr. Dwayne Donald from the University of Alberta. He asked a question, who decides if it's safe and who is it safe for? And so when we think about that, I think that's the guiding question, to really look at all of this work. And one of the things that we can do is ask the important questions, look for rephrasing for inclusive language, look at, ensuring commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion is integrated throughout. It's also a matter of, finding those processes so that when we're creating the safe space, we're starting to think about those critical languages about whose knowledge is it, and how can we, create those spaces and select that selection process as well that we can focus on.
All right, John, what about you? How would you like to add to that?
Well, so I would add that, this isn't about click, get a lesson, right? And click, build your curriculum. This is about building an experience for learners through a conversation with these tools. And we use them as assistants, not as the providers of content. We are the experts. We need to retain our own critical thinking and ability to kind of say when a tool's not getting something right, and ask it whose voices have been left out. It will tell you, it has training on the issues around equity and inclusion. It just doesn't give you those by default, because that's not the probable, predictable response most people are looking for. So we have to go in it kind of preloaded to ask those kinds of questions. In Minnesota, there's a publication project of the Shakopee, Mdewakanton, and Sioux communities, and they created this document for educators. It's a Minnesota Native American Essential Understandings for Educators. So the reason I bring that up is because we are compelled by our state academic standards to address Dakota and Anishinaabe texts. So when we are doing that, and so many of our educators don't have experience with those populations, we can upload this document to ChatGPT and have a conversation with it. And as we're building our lessons and materials and sharing resources and asking it, does it align with the principles in these documents? So those teachers who may not have a community to lean on to get the support they need, they can take these documents that have been put out by organizations like this, and we don't just read it and hope we've retained it. We can read it and have conversations about the content that's in it as we build our material, and ask questions. If I do this activity with my learners, am I adhering to the principles of this document? Again, not enough, but what I've found that in the last year and a half, I've had more conversations with other educators than I've had in the previous 25. So it's really exciting to me that this has allowed us to have these kinds of conversations and these topics that come up, and we can push back on each other and figure out who's getting the best results and how. But it really is a collaborative effort, and it isn't something where we're just going to magically save ourselves loads of time by turning it over to a machine.
So I want a follow up for you, John. We were lucky enough to have you in the AI and Learning Summit last year. You and I have worked on this a little bit before, over the last, let's say, 18 months. I remember our first conversation, it was districts are shutting this down, right? They were sending out a message saying, hey, teachers, you can't use this. Almost like, the ostrich putting their head in the sand kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so what's your reflection now? We're coming up on mid 2024.
Yeah.
Has there been a shift? So my question is ultimately, is there now an open conversation in schools, in districts, in curriculums, at least in North America, around how do we use this? And then a sub question for you to answer is, if I'm somebody who wants to flex on this, how do I bring my colleagues into this conversation?
Yeah. So just like was predicted, that shutdown, don't use it, block it, didn't work. Right. So, everyone found their workarounds. Programs within districts started getting licenses to other platforms that will do some of this work. And it slowly integrated into so many applications that districts had already purchased. So, it wasn't realistic to do that. So I just want to acknowledge that, this is happening now without sufficient conversation and guidance. So I think the more progressive districts that are just acknowledging the inevitability of access to these tools, and that people are just inclined to go in and try them out and use them, there are quite a few that are actually having conversations now, and states that are putting out some guidance. None of it fast enough. We just don't move that fast in this field. So I do have strong concerns. When we talk about these issues, people have excitement about the tools, but I also want to temper that a little bit with the reality that we are giving a platform to AI, bot text, before we've given that same platform and agency to all of the people in our communities. So if we're going to start feeding all of this machine talk, these large language model responses out into the public, and learners will start to sound more and more like that, then the machines will sound like us. Now we've got an issue where whose voice is really being represented and heard. If the majority of the training on these models does have elements of white supremacy and misogyny, and I want to be careful when we're having these conversations that is always part of, and maybe the driving force behind these topics.
Thank you. Awesome. Peter, I want to give you that same question as someone who is now in hundreds of organizations and hundreds of schools and whatnot. How have you seen these spaces change in terms of conversations around educators, between administration and educators, between districts, especially from, maybe a other side of the planet perspective from North America? Is it, obviously, is the buzz still in the hallway? Are things opening up? And, what do those initiatives look like? Nope, I think you're muted, Peter.
Apologies. Yeah, I mean, the way education is structured in the UK is quite different to the US in some ways. So talking about things like districts isn't really, we don't have an analogous thing to that. In terms of the awareness and use of AI, it's a hugely mixed picture. Sometimes when I go into colleges and universities and I say, put your hands up, how many of you use things like ChatGPT? Even to a group of 100, 200 teaching staff, it may be less than 10%. So in terms of the use of these kind of AI tools, it is still very much a minority sport in the UK. And that's what tools like Teachermatic are out there to try to address. But I think to talk about these things around safe spaces and how we address these kind of issues, I think this is incredibly important, that we've got to be aware that this technology comes with biases. And so how do we address that? Well, whenever I'm doing any training, I always say to any teacher, it's you've got to look at any AI output, whether that's from Teachermatic, whether it's from ChatGPT, Claude, Bing, Copilot, whatever. Before you ever use that, you've got to look at it. You've got to check it. You've got to put your professional expertise and judgment into it. So I talk about AI as being, it's like having this amazing assistant who's working with you. But this assistant might at times be a bit crazy and have some weird biases. And you've just got to keep your eye out for those before you share anything this assistant gives you with your students. I think in terms of the overall, how do we deal with these things? It's very important that teachers have that awareness. So I think training for teachers, make sure that teachers know about these potential biases, make sure they know what they should be looking out for, how to deal with those. A big part of it is also from the top, and it's absolutely crucial that all education organizations, universities, colleges, schools, whatever, have very clear policies, very clear guidelines around the use of AI, around what its benefits are, making sure that it's been used in a beneficial way for their staff, for their students, but also with a big awareness of the potential dangers. And that there's a great deal of awareness of that. There's a great deal of looking out for these things, a lot of training in it. There are reporting mechanisms where staff can flag up if they're seeing something that they have a concern about, that students are trained in it, and that student representative bodies, in the UK we have students' unions, we have students' reps, that we make sure that our students are aware of how AI is being used within the organisation, and that they're aware of what these potential dangers are, and that their student body is looking out for these things and reporting these back. So there's a few ideas.
Thank you very much. Solange, I want to come to you with a similar question, but I want to riff off of a question from Michael Osborne, and this is just a reminder to everyone as well. If you're listening on LinkedIn, on YouTube, I don't believe we can see the comments from X, but you LinkedIn or YouTube, please, if you have comments or you'd like to put your thoughts or how what your reality is in your institution, we'd love to hear them, because that's what we're here. We love to have an interactive session. But Michael's asking, he's aware of learning designers are using AI in creating learning, right? Which is, I think, that's where a large part of your practice goes. But he's wondering how much is being done on the learner side. And so I'm wondering, does your practice also touch on, when you're working with clients, when you're working with institutions or groups, how much of that balance is there? Or are we still really sort of like, hey, how do we deal with the institution and the educator side?
Excellent. Thank you. Most of my clients are within higher education backgrounds, so universities, colleges, and part of my role is coming in for curriculum development for bachelor degree programs, master's degree programs, or also for curriculum review for government. So in that preparation piece, often, we start to think about how can we bring in other tools to do that? And it's a matter of always going back to what are the outcomes or the program outcomes as a way of kind of sifting through some of that information and sifting through what is it that we're really looking for to make sure that all of those components are connecting and interconnecting. I think it's also important to really, think about not only for content, but also for learning. Educators are learning alongside students. And, with it was a rapid learning curve for a lot of educators during the pandemic. And now, we're starting to see students showing up in post-secondary where that's where they lived and grew up, and, those formative years. And so I think it's a matter of finding ways that we can bring those two spaces together, and definitely providing a lot of opportunities to provide professional learning for educators. So, just that comment about, the bias, the hidden bias, the implicit bias, a lot of those things, as educators went through their systems of learning from around the world, those conversations weren't necessarily happening. So how can we use AI to start those conversations, to create that space? And system leaders have that, responsibility to really create that time and resources to let that happen.
Let me follow up with that question then. Like, is there any prescriptive or a framework or a process that you're currently either advising or putting out there about, look, this is new, we're all learning together, this is something that we're kind of figuring out on the fly in a lot of ways, but are there now things that you're recommending that says, look, this is, we need to think about bias, and here's a process for doing that, or we need to think about inclusivity, and here's a process for doing that? Are those things that you're putting out in your practice at this time?
Yeah, absolutely. Using the relational model for teaching and learning, it's really that approach that education is more than what you know and do. It's who you are and how you relate to those around you. So if you think about, sustainability, if you think about equity, diversity, inclusion, anti-racism, there's a space in that, especially when we think about ways of being. And that's where a lot of guidelines and frameworks, policies can help, really govern that aspect. So policies for use of AI, practices, standards, as well as exemplars. Like, this is what success looks like. And so having those vulnerable conversations of sharing, hey, in my experience, this is what worked really well. And in that, spirit and intent of sharing and reciprocity, this is where I try to bring in, my Indigenous methodologies, my Indigenous ancestry into this space as well, is to find more holistic ways of doing that. When we think about ways of knowing, we can think about, when we actually look at the resources and look at those perspectives, and we talked a little bit about that. But when we think about the doing piece, and I think this is really where we can have a deeper look at what does success look like, and not relying on external factors to determine that. So there are some pieces that you have to do the heavy lifting for as an educator to determine this is what success looks like. And maybe AI is the process of having options to select from, but that core decision, that's where educators and diverse perspectives just have to be in the room to answer that.
Yeah, and I love that answer because it also dovetails wonderfully with a comment from Dr. Sarita, whose name I hope I'm saying correctly. But John, I want to give this one to you, which is, she says we're referring to AI as an assistant, which Peter put out there. And quite frankly, I think many of us think of it that way. She says it might seem helpful, but it diminishes the reality that we're offloading critical thinking to algorithms and potentially allowing AI to shape our understanding of the world. So as Solange, was saying there, I'd love to hear your perspective as well as what you're working with districts on, or as you're building curriculum with colleagues or whatnot that says, we have to watch out that it's not the cart leading the horse, that we're still in front there. And anything that you want to put on the table there.
Yeah, well, it's what I'm most terrified of, that we would turn our thinking over to a machine, especially on topics as important as making sure that everyone was represented and included, and that we were teaching multiple perspectives. So a lot of the work that I'm doing right now outside of my own teaching is developing modules and workshops and talks for groups where we talk about how to sufficiently alter your prompts, and we'll do some work with default prompting, put in an academic standard, get a lesson, click one of these buttons and see what you get out of it, versus the kind of the building of a conversation through the context of a chat with one of these large language models by incorporating multiple perspectives, social emotional learning frameworks. We can just flat out paste those right in and ask for a demonstration of care in the language. We can ask for anti-racist examples. We can ask for, a lot of times when we're asking for examples, let's say I get a list of writers who write about nature, and I get Ralph Waldo Emerson and a bunch of white men. I have to go in and ask for Somali, for Hmong, for Latino. I have to keep asking for these groups, and it still leaves out women. So we have to have a background and an understanding in our own implicit biases, so that we know where we're deficient. And so we can even ask these tools to assess that for us. Like, who am I leaving out? And then it will tell us, right? And then we push back on each other in that way. But the idea that we would just, like the question said, diminish the reality that we're offloading critical thinking to algorithms. I'm afraid of it. So that's why I've put so much effort into trying to get this perspective out there as well, because we are inundated in all of our experience and social media feeds with here are these tools, use them. If you're not using them, you're falling behind. Look how easy it is. Right. But, I like to be first on everything too. And I like to innovate and early adopter and all that. But I think, we do need to pump the brakes a little bit and talk about what does responsible use look like? And how are we really supporting our learners? Because students don't go into it asking those kinds of questions.
Not at all. At least my 15-year-old doesn't. My 13-year-old doesn't, for sure.
Yeah. So I'll end it there. But there are ways to do this. There are ways to redirect the large language models in a way that does create something closer to what aligns with our values.
So, at the risk of putting you on the spot, Peter, you did, in your introduction and sort of early in the conversation, you said, look, prompt engineering, it is it's a skill you've got to build. It's a muscle you've got to build. So in this context here, how much can we, or should we go beyond policy at a, in a school or in an education situation to say, look, here's a prescriptive part of the prompt that you should put in that says, give me a reflect on, your answer is in terms of racism, in terms of women's rights, in terms of this, is that a part of the prompt that we should be prescribing to educators, or is it context specific, I guess?
I think it is context specific, but I think good prompt engineering would certainly including things in your prompts that would address racism, sexism, ageism, other things that might address different minorities. So absolutely. And we do try to, with Teachermatic, we refine and test what Teachamatic does is it does the prompts in the background. So the teacher just says, I want some multiple choice questions on fractions or on Karl Marx or whatever the subject is, and it will give them some that we would say you will then look at, maybe amend, maybe tweak, whatever. But it saves you time. So yeah, good prompt engineering should make sure that what the large language models turns out is inclusive. It's a tricky one, the people behind the large language models are constantly trying to find ways to address the biases in them. And I think we all saw a couple of months ago what was both deeply comical and deeply disturbing, the multicultural Nazi stormtroopers that came out of I think the Google image maker, where they sort of they were aware that the images that were being produced were largely perhaps I want a picture of a doctor and you'll get lots of white men who are doctors, etc. And so they said, right, let's make sure this doesn't happen and make sure that when we produce images, it produces a nice multicultural mix. Somebody asked for some images of Nazi stormtroopers, and we had the very bizarre multicultural Nazi stormtroopers. So yeah, it's crucial. We've got to get these things right, and it's got to happen at every single level. It's got to happen at the level of the people doing the training, building the large language models. It's got to happen in terms of the teachers need the right training to how they do the prompting. But as I said previously, most teachers really struggle with this. It's a minority sport, and I think we're a long way off getting to the point where most teachers can do prompt engineering. And so the people who are building the tools like us, it's our responsibility to make sure that the outputs of our tools are inclusive. And finally, I think where the training for teachers perhaps is more, it's not so much about being skilled prompt engineering. That's almost like asking teachers to be skilled programmers. That's not, it's a minority sport. It's not something that most teachers are going to find easy. But being skilled, what teachers are already skilled at, because it is seeing bias. The teachers hopefully have gone through a lot of training throughout their careers around racism, around sexism, around homophobia, around all sorts of different biases, and they should be good at spotting that. And so it's just saying, look, if you're using AI, there are some particular issues around AI that there might be some biases in there. You've got to look out for them if you're using that.
Thank you very much. Before we move on from this topic, Solange, I wanted to offer you the last word here as someone who's building curriculum and as someone who's consulting on this. Talk to me about the higher level. Right now, we've Peter was talking about sort of the educator level and maybe even just the school level. But what about the higher level around institution, district, government? Like, what role do they play in this piece of thinking about how do we create these safe spaces? How do we create these frameworks? And anything from your experience or anything that you could advise us on around take this as the next step.
Excellent. One of the things that, when we're talking about safe spaces, and again, starting to think about, where does discrimination show up? Where does racism show up? I think, first of all, that just general acknowledgement, it is in these spaces. And so having, a systemic approach to addressing it, and it definitely requires learning. It's an ethical imperative that people start to understand what this looks like. When you have, government documents talking about, doctrine of discovery and, who founded Canada, and it lists the French and the British, I think we're missing a key part of the story. So, that's how it's showing up in some of these places. So it's a matter of having those conversations. And actually, government is also one of my clients is starting to look at, what does anti-racism work look like, that active anti-racism work. So there has to be some foundational knowledge to start. And then there needs to be a critical look at, internally, what are the resources? What are we using to say who we are? What are our policies? I know one of the first things I do on LinkedIn whenever I see, we're focusing on equity inclusion, or we're focusing on Indigenous issues or Indigenous education. I'll look at an organization, I'll go and look at their board of directors, and I'll take a quick scan and see, how is the community being represented? I'll look at senior leadership, how's it being represented? And so we need seats at the table. We need to be in those conversations. And, I was part of a project in 2019 with UNESCO, UNHCR, Google, Learning Equality. And it was about using machine learning to kind of map those curriculum resources with content. And, I brought that perspective of some Indigenous methodologies into those conversations where no one was thinking about that in the room, that knowledge, that perspective wasn't included. And so I just really think from a systems level, at a foundational level, you have to show up with some knowledge and understanding, but then also be bringing in additional people.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing as well, like from all three of our panelists, if I can use one word, it's intentionality, right? It's really showing up and being super intentional about what not what we're looking for, because I think John, I got this idea from you, if I'm not wrong. It's really easy to have this conversation turn into a gotcha, right? Where it's like, rather, we're looking for the either the teacher or the district or the school or whatever that did it wrong, rather than the opportunity to say, hey, how can we work together to get it right? Right. And so, John, I want to offer this to you as sort of a way to flip the script and, take our conversation in slightly a different direction, in that if I'm a student, if I'm a teacher or whatever, and so here I am, there's policies around me, I'm receiving curriculum, I'm receiving learning. How can I use AI, or how can my guide, my teacher, how can they help me to support myself in, if I'm struggling academically or emotionally, or I have learning disabilities or whatever, to, in a safe way, with privacy concerns, with, equity concerns, et cetera, like that.
Yeah, well, I'll just maybe to both points, we are going to get it wrong. Like that's kind of my default operating status, is to get it wrong first and then learn from that. So, a lot of what I do, I try to share as many of my mistakes and what I learned from them as possible, hoping other people can avoid that. With students in particular, they're for sure going to get it wrong. I would have used it for everything. So I get the desire to go out and do an assignment that way. But what I stopped doing was accusing students of using it and setting up a contentious relationship where I say they used it, they say they didn't, their parents say they didn't, but I know they did. So what do I do with that, right? Like, there is nothing you can do that fosters a positive relationship with that student if you're just arguing that point. So I started really focusing on what are some of those qualities inherent in large language model type text, and developing rubrics around helping students to avoid that type of writing. So if it's including broad overgeneralizations, a lack of personal examples or insights, if the vocabulary isn't quite right, are they including support right from their source? I want to make sure that there's an alignment to all the assignment requirements. The citations is a big one because so many of them fail in that regard. So if I score them on those things, instead of what we traditionally would score things on for the grammar, the spelling, the formatting, those kinds of issues, the introductory elements with the words and the clauses that start off every large language model paragraph. If I push back on all that stuff, now they can start to see that response from one of these tools wasn't sufficient. And now they can even realize that, where did they fail to insert themselves into that text? So they may use a large language model to do some brainstorming, but I don't want it writing their first draft. I think that's where a lot of the thinking happens. Go ahead and have it polish that up and help you with that. So what I'm asking for learners is to share with me your the version history of your document. Share with me the links to these large language models that if you're using it, I want to see how you built this out through your prompts. And then I can suggest to you ways that might have been more efficient or things you could have avoided. But it really, it is more collaborative in that way and not just a pushback. Again, and when we don't compel students to get accounts, right? Like I wouldn't, I wouldn't do that. So it's always optional. But if I have a student reach out to me and say, I'm really struggling with my anxiety right now, I'm really struggling with my time management right now, I might go and plug some of those factors into one of these large language models, get some suggestions, and then knowing what I know about that student, which ones could I safely suggest that might be likely, and then we have a conversation with those. So, it is helpful to have kind of a second opinion, even if it's AI, help build some of those suggestions. And then I'm kind of the realistic one that decides, well, that was silly. Like, I'm not going to tell them to do that. So, it is building it that way. A lot of times in my assignments now, I'll just give them the AI version first to remove the temptation to do that. And I'll have them critique that and tell me what was missing from that. What could we include that would be more suitable response for this assignment? So I'm really just playing around with accepting the fact that we exist in a world with these tools now, and they're only going to get better.
Yeah, I love that, and I want to kind of star that or flag that, something that you I think you just did naturally, but I think that we're still so on the bleeding edge of this new technology. Is you just described a thing where it's like, look, I don't have to just use it for the big tasks, right? Hey, I'm going to create my curriculum for the semester, or I'm going to, here's what this course should do, or anything like that. Like, you're just like, wow, I've got a question that I know that I'm going to have a tough meeting. Give me some suggestions about how to, what I could bring to this tough meeting. Like, what are the talking points I could use? Or, I'm struggling about how to make sure that the schedule for these 5 students works out. And, we have this really, really quick brain that can help us. You put in a couple of the factors and it at least gives you a prompt to start from, right? It gives you a starting place. And I just want to call that out, because one of the things that, when we're thinking about safe spaces in AI is, how are we alleviating some pressure from teachers so they can focus on students, right? How can we alleviate pressures from professors? So it's like, it's less about, policy in the university and administration, those kinds of things. It's more about, hey, how am I creating better learning? And so I just want to offer that to the group as well.
Well, I just think about the things that I don't like the most about, what I do. Like, I don't like the formatting aspects of things. I don't like, necessarily a lot of the brainstorming components. I don't like coming up with SMART goals. I don't, that kind of stuff we can easily turn over. Like when our English language arts department was tasked with identifying the essential academic benchmarks from the new academic standards that came out. Well, like, that's tedious, time-consuming work that takes hours, right? But we could get some suggestions very quickly within a few seconds from one of these tools, and then we can spend our time as English teachers arguing about it, which was like, that's what we love to do.
Yeah,
right?
a lot more fun.
And so we left that day not depleted and like, we got to do this again tomorrow too. Like, we were energized, and it was a friendly, intense conversation. So it's those kinds of things that would deplete that cognitive load that we can get some assistance for, as long as we are then being the responsible humans and evaluating the large language model response.
Fantastic. Peter, I want to throw a technical question your way. That's from one of our guests here, Gregory Louie. And before I do that, I want to remind everyone, we've got about, let's say 10 minutes or so left in this conversation. So if you do have a question, if you've got an opinion, if you've got an observation, an experience that you want to share, throw it in the chat in LinkedIn or in YouTube, and we'll either try to get it to one of our panelists, or at least we can have it there for posterity to continue the conversation in the comments. So Peter, the question comes in from Gregory. It says, he's curious about the experience of the panel about ingesting source documentation like the diversity and inclusivity standards, and what LLM you use in order to do this. And then how do we then continue to return to it? And so I'm not sure if this is too technical or too refined for this conversation, but how does that work with Teachermatic, or how does that work with, do you create a walled garden for each school that you work with, or do you, like, how do you make sure that the source material you're working with is that way?
Yeah, so I mean, I can answer this very briefly. I really want to come back and talk about students if I can do that afterwards.
100%. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, sure.
but,
Well,
I'll certainly answer this.
why don't you finish the conversation on students, and then we'll go down the technical path here.
Yeah, I think in terms of ethical standards, bias, fairness, that there's one elephant in the room that we haven't touched on yet, which is digital inequality. And this is perhaps the thing that scares me most about AI, which is that not all young people have equal access to AI, and both within our nations and more dramatically worldwide. So, I'm very aware in the UK, the good AI costs money. That if you want to have, Microsoft Copilot, the 365, $30 a month kind of thing, you need a certain income to be able to afford that. And you can do fabulous things with that. That if you're a poor student from a less well-off background, you're not going to be able to afford that. You're going to be stuck with ChatGPT 3.5 as your kind of default tool, while the better off students have got access to some fabulous tools and fabulous AI tutors that individual students can tap into. Now, when you move beyond the US and in my case the UK, that issue is even bigger. As I spent a lot of the last couple of years in Jordan, working in schools where, literally in a school for 1,000 kids, there might be 6 working computers, and these are computers that are 20 years old. What excess? So, if you think about this in a global sense, these kids have no access to AI. How is this going to AI? And this really scares me, is increasing the digital divide worldwide. That these kids are going to be falling behind, further and further behind in terms of what they're able to do, in terms of what they're able to engage with. So I just want to flag that up as something that really, really troubles me and really worries me. And in terms of fairness, equality, inclusivity, we do need to think about that, in our own organisations, that, in a college or in a university in the UK and US, we need to think about those kids that can't afford the good AI and how we're addressing that.
Well,
the kids that don't have phones. Not all kids have phones.
I just want to put an "and" on the end of that, because it's not just the kids, right? I mean, as Solange will attest to as well, like in higher education, adult learners who are coming back, or adult learners who are interested, like those are the people who are most likely to not have access, or be showing up at the school because that's where the internet connection is, or these types of things. So I think it's an "and" in terms of, let's think about both device access, connectivity access, and then I'm going to tie it in a bone here so that we can move on to another one. But if we think about that in a inclusive way, for lack of a better term, if I show up and I give you my computer that I'm working on right now, and you have never used it before, it's no good for me to give it to you, right? So that the training behind and the innate, hey, I've been working with a computer for the last 15 years stuff is also something we need to think about as well. But I really appreciate you putting that on the table.
Yeah. And then just on that, all the large language models are generally trained in English. So if you're trying to engage in AI in a language that isn't English, there's not as much, it's not going to be as good.
Right.
Because it hasn't had the training.
100%. So I want to offer you, Peter, the opportunity to address that one question from our guest about training. Where do you put in? Where would you?
So Teachermatic,
and then I want to kind of round out our conversation with, like, let's look ahead.
Yeah, Teachermatic uses primarily ChatGPT 3.5. ChatGPT 4 is what we plug into, in terms of we have an API that plugs into those. And over time, there's lots more large language models coming on the market that are available. And for the different tools, we envisage we'll be using a whole menu of them. And whichever large language model gives the best output for a particular tool, whether that's creating a scheme of work, creating lesson plans, creating multiple choice questions, creating group learning activities. And sometimes 3.5 is better than 4. It's so, and I think as we use different models, so we will increasingly be using a range of different models.
Fantastic. Solange, I want to come back to you. As we're wrapping up here, we've got about 5 minutes left. I want to give everybody kind of a final statement on, looking ahead. Are there, like, these are the 3 steps, or these are the things that you're either recommending to your clients, or that you see as trends that like, look, here's how we move in this direction. So I offer that to you.
Thank you. One of the things I think about is that people don't show up in their places of work. Educators aren't known for showing up to think of, how can I oppress? How can I discriminate? How can I, further disparity? People don't show up into education spaces. And so to me, the real focus looking ahead is having that human-centered approach to building capacity, and starting to think about, the community that needs it. How many have used a card catalog? Is that how you access knowledge when you were learning? And if you're a card catalog generation, where the knowledge and the information was in a little drawer that you had access to, we need to start thinking about, that human-centered building capacity, and from a systems level, who controls and distributes the knowledge. And so that really is going to need to be the focus, and to look internally for each organization. And so one of the things I'm focusing on is how do we do that inventory? How do we do that scan? And so coming up on June 21st, I do have some resources coming out and some courses coming out specifically on that to support, because that's probably my number one request in my work, is decolonizing and indigenizing content and programs.
Thank you very much. John, I want to offer the same question to you. Is, trends, here's the next 2-3 steps that you can take in this conversation, etc. Some tangible kind of next steps for people.
Well, I think acknowledging the desire path, right? Like that there are these things, regardless of what we try to do, that humans are going to do what they want to do anyway. So no matter how many guardrails, no matter how many suggestions, we just have to acknowledge that, I want to be a realist and know that this is going to happen. So what steps should we put in place to accept the fact that people are just going to dive in and start using these tools, often inappropriately? So I do, once a week, I put out a new little 2-hour module on my inclusiveaistrategies.com site. I plan on doing that at least through June. And really it has to do with the issues we've been talking about today, the propensity of these tools to generate sycophantic responses. They're products, right? Like, that's not like there aren't people making money off this stuff. So they're not going to give us answers that we don't want to see. They're going to give you the answers you want, so you keep coming back and using them. So we have to understand that's one of its kind of default core operating principles, is to satisfy and humans above all else want to see answers that correspond with what they already believe. So we have to understand that and be ready to talk about that with people in ways that aren't accusatory but supportive. And that's where I guess I would want to leave it, is being giving people a little bit of grace. They're not out there hopefully trying to create more white supremacy by default, but we can gently provide feedback in ways that help us get to something that again more closely aligns with our values, the values of our organizations.
Thank you. Peter, final word on this. What are your thoughts, prescriptions, advice to not only the organizations that you work with, but also everyone listening right now about taking that next step and, thinking about this going forward? Anything that you put out there for the Teacher Bannock universe?
Yeah, well, I think, we've talked a lot about the dangers and the problems with AI. I'd like to kind of finish on a positive note, which is AI can make a big difference to teacher workloads. And then when you're dealing with things like inclusivity, when you're dealing with things like different success rates for students from different backgrounds, this can make a huge difference. So, a story from one of our colleges, the City of Westminster College, which is in one of the more deprived areas of the UK, where most of the students come from, very challenging backgrounds. the teachers there have reported back to us. They did a fabulous presentation at a conference we arranged recently, where the sports team, they calculated they were saving about 8 hours per week by using AI to generate learning resources, to support their planning, and they were using that saved time to work individually with students to keep students on courses, and their success rates and their retention rates had improved significantly. So kids that might have dropped out and ended up in gangs and ended up out of work with no opportunities were getting significantly better opportunities because of the support that AI was giving to teachers that freed them up to give more support to students. So that's a very positive story, and I think there's a lot of worrying stuff, but there's some real good stories as well.
On that positive note, I want to acknowledge Michael Osborne's comment about, awareness around the use of AI and environmental sustainability. I think that's a great topic for our next webinar, next quarter. Michael, send me a message. I think that you're going to be a guest on our next webinar, but I want to thank Peter, Solange, and John for taking an hour out of your very, very busy days today to talk to us about this really important topic, right? Like, this is a great tool. These, AI is this thing that it's no longer an elephant in the room. It's right there. We're all using it. And so how do we make it better? How do we make it inclusive? How do we create safe spaces? So thank you so much for that. If you enjoyed conversations like this, you'll see at the bottom of the screen right there, right now, please come over, subscribe to the eLearn podcast over at elearnmagazine.com. You'll never miss an episode, and you'll always get to see great guests like these. But thank you so much. Have a great day.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.